In this lecture, we are going to look at the physiology of the male reproductive system. So when we look at the male reproductive system, the physiology, we're looking at the process of spermatogenesis, how our sperm formed. So you probably remember that in the male, it begins at puberty. And once puberty hits, we have these stem cells over here called spermatogonia cells. They undergo mitosis. Remember, mitosis makes a clone. And then those cells undergo meiosis. So meiosis is the process that produces the four sperm. They're first produced as spermatids, which are basically immature sperm. And so this process will happen from puberty until death in the male. They don't go through a menopause like the females do. So the spermatogonia cells are the stem cells that are going to produce the sperm, and it takes roughly 30 days for this whole process to occur. And remember, this is happening in the seminiferous tubules. So by the time you get to the lumen, this is where we're going to have the spermatid and the sperm. We talked briefly about those nurse cells or sustentacular cells. So they have a lot of functions. Basically, they form the blood-testis barrier. You've got DNA in the sperm, right? It's our future offspring, so you don't want everything from your blood to affect them. They do provide a little bit of structural support inside the seminiferous tubules. They can make different substances to activate the sperm and to help stimulate meiosis as well as initiating meiosis. They are protective. They do some phagocytosis, and they release inhibin. And remember, inhibin is going to go up to the anterior pituitary gland and inhibit FSH. So when you get the sperm, you get an immature sperm called a spermatid. The spermatid has to become the mature, which is the sperm. And if we look at a sperm, there's three parts. There's a head, a midpiece, and then this long tail, which is the flagellum. So the head has the DNA. That's where the genetic material is, but it has this little coating called the acrosome, and the acrosome has enzymes that help eat away at the outer surface of the egg so that fertilization can occur. And then what will happen is the head with the DNA will go into the oocyte and deposit those 23 chromosomes. The midpiece is a lot of mitochondria. It takes a lot of energy to swim, and the sperm, remember, are going to use fructose to produce ATP, and then they have that long flagellum, which is known as the tail or flagellum. And so we can see our typical anatomy of a sperm. Well, we need to look at some hormones here. So we're looking at brain-testicular axis. And just to review, we have our hypothalamus, we have the anterior pituitary, and then we're going to have the gonads. We're going to have the interstitial cells, and then we're going to have the seminiferous tubules. So there's an axis here that's happening, and it all starts with GnRH. So GnRH was our latent hormone, and then when that surges, when that goes up, that's what triggers puberty. So GnRH's job, gonadotropin releasing hormone, although we always just say the abbreviation, is going to go to the anterior pituitary gland, and when it gets there, it's going to tell the anterior pituitary gland to release FSH as well as LH. Now, FSH and LH have slightly different functions. FSH's job is to go to the seminiferous tubules and go tell those nurse cells or those sustentacular cells to concentrate testosterone and start the process of meiosis. So it triggers the formation of sperm. It also releases inhibin, and inhibin works like negative feedback to go back up and turn down FSH. LH, on the other hand, is going to go to the interstitial cells and tell them to make testosterone. So both of these hormones are critical for normal functioning of the male reproductive system. Now, when we look at testosterone, a lot of times we call it an androgen. An androgen is just a masculinizing hormone. It's the most important one. There's several different ones. We know it causes spermatogenesis and it allows the sperm to mature. We know it's anabolic. We've talked about this a little bit before. We know that it increases your EPO levels, so increases your hematocrit. We know it causes muscle hypertrophy, muscle growth, bone growth. It affects the brain. It definitely causes libido, sex drive. It also can cause other behaviors, anger as well. And so we say that it causes the secondary sex characteristics in the male, which basically is the things that happen at puberty. So we have facial hair, you start to get more hair on your legs, your armpits, your face. The muscle mass and body size goes up, the fat tissue decreases. It changes the length of the vocal cords, so the voice gets deeper. And it helps maintain all those accessory organs. So if we're looking at the overview here, we have our GnRH starts the whole thing from the hypothalamus. It goes to the anterior pituitary. And that's the trigger for LH, which makes testosterone, and FSH, which triggers the production of sperm. But you need testosterone to make the sperm. And so you can see some of the functions here. We said it's anabolic. And when you talk about anabolic steroids, you're usually talking about testosterone because it's a steroid hormone. And it does circulate in the blood. It does need to be attached to proteins to help transport it through the blood. But there's a couple things you might have heard of. You might have heard of DHT. It's basically dihydroxytestosterone. We just say DHT. And so DHT works just like testosterone in the blood. In fact, when it binds, some of it comes back out in the blood as DHT. So it's an androgen. It can be measured in your blood and kind of gives you an idea of your testosterone levels. They do know it's DHT that triggers that male pattern baldness, by the way, because it can attack the hair follicles and make them shrink. But the DHT is an indicator of how much testosterone you have. Now, so we have DHT, or dihydroxytestosterone, and we have DHEA. Now, we already talked about DHT. Remember, this is basically like testosterone. It comes from testosterone, and it's an androgen. DHEA, however, comes from the adrenal gland. So that, specifically the cortex, produces the DHEA. And it is a precursor to testosterone. It has slightly different actions. A lot of natural food and health food stores will sell DHEA and talk about supplementing with that as far as maybe giving you more of a natural boost to your androgens. I haven't seen a whole lot of support for that. When we look at testosterone, it actually begins around week 7. We know that if you are a biological male, that you have the genotype XY, and it's the Y chromosome that codes for testosterone production. And so it starts early on, and then it peaks around month 6, and then it stays low until puberty. And when that GnRH is released from the hypothalamus, that will trigger the production of basically the release of LH and testosterone. We also know that males have a little bit of estradiol, which is the main form of estrogen in the blood. It's a very small amount. Some of it actually comes from testosterone. And then andropause is kind of like the male menopause. It's not as many changes as what happens to the females. Yay, us. But you can see that with aging, the amount of testosterone does start to decrease. And we're going to wrap it up with sex. So sexual function, we have 2 things going on. We have the erection, which we talked about. It's a vascular event. Nitric oxide is released. It's your parasympathetic division that is going to cause the blood vessels to vasodilate. Now, when we've been studying the parasympathetic, we talked a lot about the vagus nerve, but remember, parasympathetic is the cranial sacral division. So it was through cranial nerves and some sacral nerves. And these are the sacral nerves that are going to supply the penis. I remember a little saying, S1, 2, 3, 4 keeps the penis off the floor. So you'll remember sacral nerves. And so what happens is more blood flows in, the veins constrict, and now you have that increase in pressure. These are some medications that are often used because they basically release nitric oxide for that erection to occur. Now, when you have the erection, then obviously you have the ejaculation, which is the orgasm portion of this. And so we have ejaculation and we have emission. So ejaculation, smooth muscle contraction, we call it an orgasm. When ejaculation occurs, it's very, very intense. Heart rate goes up, respiratory rate goes up, blood pressure, right? Emission, however, is the actual movement of the semen and the sperm out, basically into the penile or spongy urethra and out. And so that's under the sympathetic nervous system. So for the male, you need the parasympathetic and the sympathetic in order to have sex, basically, and ejaculate. The erection and the ejaculation / emission. And remember, we want to close off that internal urethral sphincter because for the male, we want to make sure that's pinched off so that we don't accidentally void any urine through the penile urethra, because remember, urine has a low pH and sperm don't do well if the pH should fall. So, if you're looking at orgasm, I'll move that out of the way. Obviously, it's intense and you should be aware of it with different patients. There are concerns, especially with cardiac patients, as far as the things that happen. So they say heart rate can go up pretty high. Systolic blood pressure increases by 80. So if you already have hypertension and it goes up even higher, then you're at a risk, obviously, of like heart attacks and strokes. The mean arterial blood pressure, 162/89, so it obviously goes up. Oxygen consumption goes up. And so the highest metabolic expenditure is going to happen during orgasm. And we know that there's some benefits associated with it. Oxytocin is known as the love hormone. This is what's released when a mother has a baby, and it helps with intimacy and bonding, and it actually goes up with orgasms. And then it also has been found to help with neurotransmitters. You can see that it helps with dopamine, which reduces stress, and it's supposed to also help you sleep better as well. So the last phase is the resolution phase, and so this is after. So you have the initial excitement, and you have that plateau, you get the orgasm, and then after that, the resolution is when everything goes back to normal. So now the blood vessels are going to constrict, the penis returns to its normal size, and we have a refractory period. So in males, the refractory period varies. It's probably most likely or usually shorter. In younger men, it gets a little longer as we get older, and the refractory period is just the time it takes to be able to get excited again and go through that process another time. And I just threw that in because I just thought that was funny. So this wraps up our male physiology lecture.